This is the Virginia Decides 7th Congressional District Forum, brought to you in partnership with ChamberRVA and VPM News. Presented by Altria. Sponsored by Capital One, Dominion Energy Center, and Hirschler. This evening's moderator is Robert Costa from Washington Week. Tonight's candidates for the 7th Congressional District are Abigail Spanberger and Nick Freitas.
Good evening and welcome to Virginia Decides, a 7th Congressional District Forum. I'm Robert Costa, tonight's moderator, and also the moderator and managing editor of Washington Week on PBS and a national political reporter for the Washington Post. Our discussion with incumbent Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger and her Republican challenger, Delegate Nick Freitas, is brought to you by VPM News and ChamberRVA. Before we begin, a brief word on tonight's format. Each candidate will deliver a 2-minute opening statement. Then I will open it up with the same question asked of both candidates. We will alternate as we go. Each nominee will be given 90 seconds to respond. About half of the questions tonight came from VPM's Citizens Agenda, which sought input from voters on issues important to them. The others were written by me. No questions were shared with the campaigns. Toward the end, I might have a lightning round with yes or no or very brief answers. Then we'll have 2-minute closing statements. Now let's begin and welcome Congresswoman Spanberger and Delegate Freitas. Our first opening statement, by virtue of a coin toss just a few minutes ago, goes to Delegate Freitas.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to Congresswoman Spanberger for agreeing to this forum. We're very excited about this race. I'm the Republican nominee for Congress here in the Virginia 7th District. My life did not start off in politics. I enlisted in the Army right out of high school. I served in the 82nd Airborne Division, the 25th Infantry Division, and a few months after 9/11, I volunteered to go to Army Special Forces, serving 2 combat tours in Iraq in 2006 and in 2008. And I really thought that's what I was going to do with my life. I loved being a Green Beret. I loved the mission and the purpose that we had in that mission. But one of the things that started to really disturb me about the political discourse in this country was I was listening to politicians running on the platform of wanting to fundamentally change this country. And it was very difficult being a service member overseas, fighting for your country, fighting for the principles enshrined in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, listening to politicians saying that that is not what the direction they wanted to go anymore. I believe that individual liberty, private property rights, self-determination, equality before the law, this is fundamental to who we are as a country. It is fundamental to who we are as a people. And so when I ran for the Virginia House of Delegates and have served there for the last 5 years, I told my constituents exactly what I would do when I'd go to Richmond, that I would always fight to ensure that we were preserving individual liberty and preserving their opportunities to pursue happiness in accordance with their definition of it, not a political elite that thinks they know better or that they can run things from either Richmond or Washington, D.C. And as we're looking at this race right now and the question that's before all of the voters, we really are having to ask ourselves, do we want a government so big, so powerful, and so intrusive that it has the ability to micromanage in every single aspect of our lives? Or do we still believe in those foundational principles which have informed our country and our people? That is what I have fought for overseas. That is what I have fought for in the Virginia General Assembly, and I will continue to fight for it in Washington, D.C. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Congresswoman Spanberger, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Costa, for moderating tonight. Thank you to VPM for broadcasting, and to ChamberRVA, thank you for hosting this forum. Delegate Freitas, thank you for being here tonight. My name is Abigail Spanberger, and I represent Virginia's 7th District in Congress. I represent the community I grew up in, the community where I was raised in a household that prioritized service. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a career federal law enforcement officer. I grew up believing that I would serve my country, and I did. As a CIA case officer, I worked at home and abroad to ensure that I was working to keep people safe, that I was helping to ensure that policymakers and the president had the vital intelligence necessary to make good decisions. And I was serving and protecting people I would never meet. And now, as a member of Congress representing this community, I continue to serve the community and our country. But the difference is I know who I'm serving. I have the opportunity to meet the people I am working for. And they are the cattlemen in Louisa County. They are row crop farmers in Nottoway County. They're the mothers who've recovered from cancer in Henrico County. They're the small business owners in Chesterfield County, and they're the children and teachers who don't have internet connectivity at home in Culpeper County. These are the people I'm serving. These are the stories that I take with me to Capitol Hill and to my work in the district. And I am focused on ensuring that the work that I do is in pursuit of the issues that matter to them. And that's, at this point in time, during this ongoing pandemic, a focus on COVID-19 relief. Relief to small business owners, that's why I've been endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Relief to workers, that's why I've been endorsed by the AFL-CIO. And relief to our farmers, that's why I've been named a friend of the Farm Bureau. I am listening to the stories of the people I represent across our district. It's what drives me, and it's why I hope that you'll cast your vote for me between now and November 3rd. Thank you.
Let's begin with the economy. That issue is front and center in Congress this week as the Speaker and the Trump administration negotiate a possible stimulus package in the $2 trillion range. Those talks come as the federal budget deficit has soared to over $3 trillion in fiscal year 2020. The first question will go to Delegate Freitas. Do you believe that another stimulus package is necessary?
It's certainly not going to have, it can't be what Nancy Pelosi has suggested with the HEROES Act. If we're going to do stimulus, the way that we need to do it is targeted spending toward those individuals and businesses that need it through no fault of their own as a result of COVID and some of the draconian shutdowns that we've seen as a result of Democrat governors all across the country. The problem is that we have a lot of small businesses here in the Virginia 7th District that have managed to survive a pandemic, but they're not going to survive a $4 trillion tax increase that Joe Biden has supported. They're certainly not going to survive a Biden Green New Deal where now we have more regulations that are harming our small businesses at a time when they're desperate to stay open. And this is also one of the reasons why people are so fed up with Washington, D.C. If we had things like germaneness, one issue per bill, just like we do in the Virginia legislature, we could actually vote on these individual expenditures in a way that makes sense. Because as we're looking at these issues, of course we want money to be able to go to people that need medical equipment. Of course we want funding to be able to go to nursing homes. Of course we want funds to be able to help small businesses that are struggling right now. But we would have never voted to send millions of dollars to the Kennedy Center. We would have never spent this time using COVID relief packages as early release for people in federal penitentiaries, nor would we have used it for a federal takeover of election law. So it's important that we pass things like one issue per bill so that we can look at these individual expenditures and we can make decisions that work best for the people that are most affected instead of voting for things like bailouts for state governments.
The same question, Congresswoman. Do you believe another stimulus package is necessary?
Another stimulus package is necessary, and I say this because I hear from the small business owners that I represent, restaurant owners in Henrico County, small business owners in Chesterfield County, and across the 10 counties of the 7th District of Virginia. Additional relief is necessary, and that's what I've been fighting for. That's why I voted against a Democratic partisan bill that came before the House in May, because it wasn't negotiated. It wasn't bipartisan. It was never going to deliver the relief that we needed. That's why I voted against another bill that came up in late September, because it wasn't negotiated. It wasn't going to become law. And that's why I have worked with a bipartisan group of lawmakers, the Problem Solvers Caucus, 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans, to put forth a framework. When leaders in the White House and in the House of Representatives and the Senate walked away from the negotiating table, I went back to it with my colleagues, and we put forth a proposal that we as a bipartisan group of legislators agreed on, recognizing the dire need for aid and the dire need for relief. And I will continue working for this, and I will continue pushing, because the businesses that I represent, the people that I represent, they need additional PPP funding. They need additional unemployment, extended unemployment, and they need direct relief so we can avoid a housing crisis. And this is an incredibly important issue. It's what I've been working for, and it's what I will continue to fight for, because the district needs it.
Thank you. Due to our rules tonight, we'll now begin the next round of questions with Congresswoman Spanberger. Many families in this district are struggling with the economic carnage from the pandemic. Do you believe income inequality should be addressed with a raise in the federal minimum wage? And if so, what should that be?
I have spoken to families across our district who are struggling at this point, moms who work multiple jobs to be able to put food on the table, and families who can barely struggle and support their own families and ensure that they can pay for their prescription drugs. And yes, we need to increase the federal minimum wage. It has been over a decade since we last did. And I have voted in support of raising the minimum wage on a phased increase to $15 an hour. I supported an amendment that would exempt certain small businesses under a certain revenue and employee level, recognizing the importance and the need for a little bit more flexibility for small businesses. But income inequality is part of it. It's also an issue of opportunity and equality of opportunity across our district and our country. That's why I've worked so hard to ensure that we're bringing broadband connectivity across the rural communities that I represent, because equality is an issue of, yes, the paycheck, but also the ability to access the marketplace, to be able to work from home, particularly in a time of a pandemic, for children to have the same levels of opportunity that exists for kids just down the street in a neighboring suburban county. And it's what I will continue to work for when I head back to Congress.
Delegate Freitas.
So if you wanted to do something that would systematically ensure greater income inequality, doubling the cost of hiring someone that is young or has low-skilled labor that needs that first job to be able to rise up within the marketplace, that's the way to do it. And that's exactly what Congresswoman Spanberger voted to do. I know what it's like to make minimum wage. I know what it's like to struggle to make ends meet. But what was so great about the American economy is that all of us have the opportunity to be able to build up within it. And it's amazing to me right now that we're telling business owners, small business owners, that are fighting to try to provide economic opportunities, not just for them, but for people that want a job and people who desperately need a job, that now we're going to double the cost of hiring someone that needs to get that initial job, to learn about work ethic, to get the necessary work experience to move up. The bottom line is this: less than 3% of the people in the labor force actually make minimum wage, and the vast majority of them won't be making a minimum wage several months down the road, provided that they can get that first job opportunity. But when you make it so expensive to hire them in the first place, youth unemployment goes up, and we know this for all the states and countries that have attempted to do this in the past. So the real solution to income inequality is to provide opportunities within the marketplace, to start it off with a good education. It is not to go in and tell small business owners that they're going to have to fire one of their employees because they can no longer afford to pay what politicians in Washington thought they should be, as opposed to what them working in compliance with their employer could actually achieve.
You would like to have a rebuttal?
Yes, please.
30 seconds.
The majority of minimum wage workers are not young people entering the workforce. They are mothers, predominantly single mothers, and oftentimes women of color, black and brown women across the country. So this is an issue of income inequality. It is not an issue of entering the workforce. And my opponent has previously voted not to have protections for pregnant women in the workforce. Income inequality is an issue of fairness. It's an issue of fairness for women, for men, for skilled and unskilled workers. That's why I support it, and I recognize the value of ensuring that a hard day's work is enough to put food on the table for a family.
If you would like to respond, you can do so in the next answer in the next question. The next question will go to Delegate Freitas first. The power of big tech in the economy is a big debate in Washington. And earlier today, the Justice Department mounted a major legal challenge to Google, arguing it has an illegal monopoly over search. Moving forward, how should Congress regulate antitrust, privacy, and foreign interference issues with tech companies?
First of all, to respond to the last statement, here's the problem. They're not going to be able to move up the economic ladder. They're not being able to get those opportunities if they can't find a job in the first place. No matter how good the intentions of what Abigail Spanberger wants to do, the result of raising the minimum wage, doubling the minimum wage, means that there's going to be fewer job opportunities for the people that need it the most. When it comes to big tech companies, I think one of the biggest problems that we've had, and we've seen this lately with Twitter and Facebook attempting to suppress information that was coming out about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, is that they are trying to operate as a publisher, but they want the legal protections of a platform. A platform has the ability to put information out there so that people can have access to information, but they're not supposed to selectively censor it in accordance with their own political views. Now, I am not a fan of the government trying to control the internet or the flow of information, but these big tech companies do have to understand if they're going to operate as a publisher, then they're going to have to face the legal consequences when they deliberately censor information simply because it doesn't fit within their preferred political beliefs. If they want to operate as a platform, fine, then allow the free flow of information. So no, we don't want government control over the internet. We don't want government control over radio and what we see in our news. But by the same token, the big tech companies have to play by the same rules that everybody else does.
Congresswoman Spanberger?
I think it's absolutely appropriate that tech firms should not be pushing Russian propaganda, and when they are made aware that that exists by the United States' FBI, they have an obligation to recognize the harm that propaganda from a foreign adversary nation can pose to our elections and our election systems. What's key here is transparency, and I have proposed and I have introduced legislation, bipartisan legislation, focused on just this, because the challenge is that there is information getting pushed out to people on social media platforms, and there's no link back to who's paying for it. There's no link back to who's driving that message. And that is an incredibly important piece. And I do believe that social media companies should be held accountable. They should be held to the same standards. When there's a television ad on the TV or on the radio, you know who is putting that ad out there. And the same requirements must be placed on political ads and other ads that go on social media. And importantly, that disclaimer of who's paying to influence the viewer, the user, needs to follow that ad along. That's what I have worked on in Congress, and that's what I will continue to push for.
Next question. When you look at taxes, who should be paying higher taxes? And in particular, should the corporate tax rate be raised? President Trump cut it from 35% to 21% with his 2017 tax law. This question will begin with Congresswoman Spanberger.
So the 2017 tax bill permanently cut taxes to corporations, that sent jobs overseas, permanently cut taxes to large pharmaceutical manufacturers that continue to increase the costs of life-saving prescription drugs. And the American people received a temporary tax cut. A tax cut that will expire in 2025. This is not good policy. It's why I didn't support the tax bill, though I wasn't yet in Congress. It's why I saw the holes in this, because what was told to us, the American people, is that the system was going to be more fair, that the system was going to be simpler, it would be easier to file taxes. This tax reform, this bill, it added trillions of dollars to the debt when we were still recovering from the recession of the last decade, and left us in a position even further unprepared to come into this pandemic. What we need to do moving forward is have an honest conversation about tax reform. And it was smart to lower the corporate tax rate, but to lower the corporate tax rate as much as we did, with permanent tax cuts to corporations and a bill that will come due for America's middle-class families, that's not the way to do it. That is not the way to do it. And I do not support raising taxes on everyday working class and middle class families.
Delegate Freitas.
The problem is again, that sounds all very good. But when you look at what Congresswoman Spanberger and her running mate are actually saying with respect to Joe Biden, they are going to do just that. They are going to raise taxes, not just on corporations. They're going to raise taxes on people here, families here within the 7th District, to the tune of at least $2,500 per household, potentially as high as $4,800 per household. I don't see how in the midst of a pandemic, when people are desperately trying to pay the bills, pay the rent, keep their businesses open, you're going to raise taxes on them at the same time. And yet that's exactly what they want to do. If you look at pre-COVID, here's what we saw. When you lowered tax rates for individuals and businesses, we saw more businesses coming to the United States. We saw them expanding the workforce and creating the job opportunities that we all need. And let's be honest, we lowered those corporate tax rates to make it more competitive with overseas competition. If you raise them back up, you're going to continue to drive businesses overseas. And this is one of the problems that we have with Democrat manipulation of the economy. They don't want to, when they talk about having to pay for tax cuts, you don't have to pay for tax cuts, you have to pay for government spending. And so it's really easy. If you don't want to raise taxes on the middle class, don't do it. But that's exactly what your party is advocating in the midst of a pandemic. What we need to do is get government spending under control.
Thank you. You have 30 seconds.
Thank you. The basic math of it is when you cut revenues, you have to make up for it somewhere. And there was a major cut to revenues coming into our nation's kitty with the 2017 tax bill. It was a permanent cut for large corporations and a temporary tax cut. So my opponent says that Democrats want to raise taxes, but that is absolutely not what we should be talking about. The fact is that the 2017 tax bill will see a raise in taxes back in 2025 because they were temporary cuts.
We're now going to begin this round with Delegate Freitas. And let's turn to health care. The Supreme Court will hear arguments after the election on President Obama's health care law. If that decision ruptures coverage for millions of Americans, should Congress step in and legislate new protections?
So everybody, from Republicans to Democrats, have all agreed that we need to protect coverage in the midst of a pandemic, but we also need to fix our healthcare system. There's been a lot of negative attack ads suggesting that I don't support people with pre-existing conditions. This is absolutely absurd. In fact, the only healthcare plan I know of that was put forward recently that actually ripped people's health insurance away from them was the Affordable Care Act. Your premiums went up. You lost your doctor when you were told you could keep them. You lost your plan when you were told you can keep it. So the first thing that we have to do when we talk about fixing our healthcare system is ensure that we stop listening to the people that deliberately lied to us about what a government takeover of healthcare would actually look like. And even now I'm hearing conversations about a public option. It's not a public option, it's a government-run option. And then what they will inevitably do is raise taxes on your private plans. They will raise unfunded mandates on your private plans. It will cause your costs to go up. You will lose your health insurance, and they will force you, and the government option will become your only option. If we're really serious about making sure that we have access to affordable and quality health care, there is one way and one way only to do it. You have to increase the supply of the doctors, the nurses, the clinics, the hospitals, the specialists. But it is Democrat regulations that are standing in the way of doing that. You talk about prescription drug prices. It was regulations at the federal level that took approving a new drug from a 7-month process to a 7-year process. And instead of going back and looking at all the ways that federal intervention into the healthcare has actually damaged it and caused people to lose access to care, they just want to come up with a new government program to do so. So the important thing is this: provide for coverage for the vulnerable when you need to, and then make sure that we increase the supply so everyone can have access to quality and affordable health care.
Congresswoman Spanberger.
For the families out there, the mother who's recovering from cancer in Henrico County, for the baby who was born premature and spent time in the NICU, for the families who rely on insulin to stay alive, the ACA is the program, is the law of the land that protects people with pre-existing conditions, that did away with caps on lifetime coverage that would impact that baby born early and who spent months in a NICU. This is the program that my opponent has called a cancer and vowed to undo. This is the only law of the land that protects people with pre-existing conditions. It is also the law that closed the donut hole for Medicare recipients, saving them $2,200. This is important because there is so much rhetoric about, well, we'll just protect people with pre-existing conditions. There is one bill that does that, and that's the ACA, and yet attack after attack is meant to undo that. If we want to talk about saving rural hospitals across Virginia, it was Medicaid expansion, which my opponent voted against, that not only extended health care to more than 50,000 people in this district, but is a key indicator of the ability to save rural hospitals across the country and here in Virginia.
Rebuttal.
30 seconds.
Again, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, and will cause the rates to go down. None of it was true. And yet they're coming back promising us that this time it will be better. The ACA is not the only thing that existed in order to protect people with pre-existing conditions. And if you want to talk about rural hospitals, since I live in a district with rural hospitals, it's things like COPN regulations that actually prevent new services from being able to come in and help underserved areas. It's why Democrats in the midst of COVID actually suspended a lot of these regulations that prevent people from gaining access to health care, but refused to suspend them permanently so we can actually fix our health care system.
Let's move on. Stay on health care. And we'll begin this round with Congresswoman Spanberger. What is your position on abortion, and should Congress take any action on this issue?
Roe versus Wade is settled law. It is settled law, and that's what I support.
Thank you. Delegate Freitas.
You know, I have no idea what it's like to be a young woman that finds themselves in a position with an unplanned pregnancy. And I do believe in individual liberty and people making their choices. But I do know what it's like to be the son of such a woman who had to drop out of college in order to have me and had a lot of people encouraging her to have an abortion. And I think it's incredible right now that I'm old enough to remember when Democrats said safe, legal, and rare. And in the General Assembly, I watched as they advocated for taxpayer-funded abortion all the way up to the point of birth. The child is moving down the birth canal. And then I watched as Governor Northam stepped forward and described in lurid detail how a child could be born and be left there to die while a conversation ensued. It's why I carried the Born Alive Act. It's why it's very frustrating that Abigail Spanberger voted against the Born Alive Act in the House of Representatives. I mean, I think we need to be able to offer people more options than just abortion. And we also need to make sure that we're raising young men that understand that you have an obligation to your children and to the mother of your children. And so I want to foster a society where we encourage life, where we welcome life into this country, and where we provide the resources for mothers that they desperately need so that they can choose life.
30 seconds, Congresswoman.
I am the mother of 3 children. I carried 3 beautiful, healthy children to term. And I have heard stories of women who have talked to me about their experiences, the hard conversations that have been had between them and their healthcare provider. And I do not believe that in those desperate, difficult conversations, there is a place for politicians to insert themselves.
More than 210,000 Americans have died due to the coronavirus. And this week, President Trump is publicly clashing with health experts such as Dr. Anthony Fauci, all as the nation braces for a tough fall and winter with the pandemic. We'll begin this round with Delegate Freitas. Should President Trump listen more closely to health experts in Washington?
I think whenever we're looking at a government response to something as significant as a pandemic, of course we need to listen to health experts. We also need to listen to economists, public policy experts, logisticians, because we need a comprehensive approach in order to deal with COVID. It is absolutely mind-boggling to me that Joe Biden is now threatening nationwide lockdowns, which are not only unconstitutional, but according to the World Health Organization, don't even work and have dire consequences, not just for the economies, but for people's health as well. We've seen models that work far better, whether it's in Sweden, whether it's in various states within the United States, where we can actually open our businesses responsibly while at the same time effectively responding to COVID. We know right now that COVID has a high mortality rate for people above the age of 80, for people with pre-existing conditions, and obviously we need to focus our medical resources to those areas. We should never allow another situation that happened right here in the 7th District, where you have a significant amount of deaths taking place within nursing homes because additional resources were not provided by our governor in order to make sure that someone leaving a nursing home with COVID could be isolated and get the care that they need without being reintroduced into an environment full of vulnerable people. So yes, listen to the medical experts, but listen to all the experts and follow a scientific approach. And when it becomes obvious that what we were doing before doesn't work, don't double down on the same strategies that Joe Biden is suggesting we should.
Congresswoman?
More than 220,000 Americans have died. They are loved ones who will never come home because of this virus. Millions of Americans are out of work, and small businesses continue to close their doors every single day. We need a coordinated approach. We need leadership from the White House that models behaviors like wearing a mask, listening to scientists, and a plan to ensure that we get the PPE that we need. Notably, my opponent mentioned the lack of PPE and supplies in the long-term care facilities. I know all about that because I fought and spoke to CMS Administrator Seema Verma to ensure that we would get what we needed in terms of relief down to long-term care facilities when the initial formularies were benefiting hospitals at the expense of those who are in long-term care facilities. But notably, my opponent voted against allowing the governor to be able to purchase and supply PPE and testing supplies. In the early stages of this pandemic, we saw that states were competing with states, hospital systems were competing with hospital systems, and the coordinated response that should have come was not there. And so it is incredibly important that we be able to deliver the PPE, and the testing supplies in order to get this virus under control, because the way that we will reopen our economy fully and completely and bring back consumer confidence is by ensuring that we have beaten this virus.
30 seconds.
So the governor does have authorization to buy PPE. They wanted to completely change the law where it would have made it more difficult for someone to be able to go into the private sector. And I had to fight for my local first responders in Culpeper and my House of Delegates district to be able to get the PPE that they needed and be able to stockpile it within the government, where they do a horrible job distributing it the way it needs to be distributed quickly and effectively is not the answer going forward. But again, I would love to hear Congresswoman Spanberger say whether or not she thinks, as Joe Biden does, her endorsed candidate for president, that we need to go into another national lockdown at this point.
Let's stick with this. This is such a critical issue in the election because regardless of who wins the White House, they will be dealing with the fallout of the pandemic next year. So let's say you meet with them in the Oval Office in late January. Congresswoman Spanberger, what would you tell the next president, whether it's Vice President Biden or President Trump, to make a priority on the pandemic in 2021?
The priority has to be getting this pandemic under control. The priority has to be a coordinated strategy where we, the United States, are leading in the world on how to get this virus under control, where we have a president who listens to scientists, who shares information openly and correctly with the American people so that they can make decisions about how to protect themselves based on science and based on knowledge. That is what's important. And I have been an advocate for sponsoring legislation to request that the White House utilize the Defense Production Act, because I believe in the strength of the United States and our ability to deploy the PPE and the vaccine, and the testing components that are necessary for us to be able to aggressively understand where this virus is on the verge of an outbreak and be able to get that under control so that we can open our economy completely and fully, so that we can restore consumer confidence, and so that we can get back on the progress on a path towards saving lives and improving back on a path towards our economy stabilizing.
Delegate Freitas.
There needs to be a specific task force assigned to duties and responsibilities like that in order to facilitate coordination between federal, state, and local governments. One of the things that we did a good job of was being able to flex medical resources, additional resources to those potential hotspots so that we didn't overwhelm our medical system. And we need to continue to put that in place. As we learn more about the virus, we also understand that if you're below the age of 60, there's probably a 0.006% chance that this can be fatal. But if you're 80, it jumps up significantly. And we need to make sure that we're allocating resources to those areas, especially nursing homes and extended living facilities, to make sure that they have what they need in order to potentially give life-saving treatment and drugs to the people that need it, while again isolating people that might be in a position to transmit it to other people that are vulnerable. The other thing that we have to do at the same time is that we have to allow our economy to safely and responsibly reopen. If you don't do that, you're not going to have a tax base. Too many of my Democrat colleagues don't seem to understand that you can't tax what you haven't allowed other people to earn. And if you don't have that tax revenue, you're not going to be able to get the additional resources in the midst of a pandemic that you desperately need. So it's twofold. We know who is the most affected by the pandemic now. We need to allocate resources and have better coordination between state, local, and federal. And then on the other side, make sure that we're providing the resources so that the economy can reopen in a safe and responsible manner.
There is a reckoning on race happening in Virginia and across the country. We'll begin this round with Delegate Freitas. What should the federal government do in response, especially on federal policing laws and policies?
I think one of the most comprehensive criminal justice reform packages that was passed in a generation was passed by President Trump, the First Step Act. And I think there was a lot of positive moves in that. I've carried criminal justice reform legislation here in the Virginia General Assembly, and I'm proud to say we got it passed. I think one of the most important things that we can do with respect to federal policing is understand that if you really want strong policing, it has to be community policing. And too often, federal law enforcement can come into a situation where, because they have the additional budget, local departments can be enticed away to prioritize federal concerns over local concerns. Eleanor Ostrom, who's the first woman that won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and left the lab and got into the back of a police car and walked into the communities and studied the problems with the police consolidation movement, has excellent feedback on the way that we can get back to community-based policing, and understanding that, yes, the federal government has a role, obviously, to play in law enforcement and to assist state and local law enforcement agencies. But those state and local law enforcement agencies need to be primarily focused on the communities or the priorities which are established, not just by the law enforcement entities themselves, but by the communities that they're serving.
Congresswoman?
This summer, we saw the death of George Floyd with a uniformed police officer with his knee on a man's neck as he begged for his mother as he lay dying on the ground. There is a clear need for change and improvement in the United States. And as I have spoken with sheriffs and police chiefs across this district, it is clear that the commitment to our community is just as strong as ever within our local police departments. And from a federal perspective, I supported the Justice in Policing Act, which is a bill that would outlaw moves like a carotid hold or a choke hold, utilizations of force that have left numerous people across this country dead. And it would outlaw no-knock warrants in the cases of narcotics arrests, which is the circumstance under which Breonna Taylor was killed in her own apartment. And it's important to note that this bill also provided additional funding for training and for efforts for police officers to be able to have the skills they need and the training they need to be able to respond in a time of immense crisis. And it's another reason why I voted for additional COPS funding, which is a program that sent more than $4 million right here to Central Virginia, and specifically just under $2 million to Chesterfield County, where they were able to use those funds to hire 15 additional police officers. There is a role in the federal government to ensure the pathway towards strong training and strong staffing so that we can have police departments across the country who are honoring their communities that they are working in.
Rebuttal.
You have a 30 seconds rebuttal.
There's a reason why law enforcement organizations that endorsed Congresswoman Spanberger in 2018 have abandoned that endorsement and now endorse me. It's because as these riots were taking place and as law enforcement were being deliberately targeted, Congresswoman Spanberger remained silent. And we're now in a situation where you have a small child in a hospital praying for the life of their mother, who happens to be a sheriff's deputy who was ambushed, while a crowd stands out front and says, "I hope they die." Law enforcement needed to know that, yes, while we need reform, we also have their backs, because we recognize that the vast majority of them are doing an incredibly difficult job. And if you want to know how hard it is for law enforcement officers right now, don't talk to police officers and deputies, because they'll put on a brave face and tell you so. Go talk to their children. Go talk to their children when they have to go to school and see what that environment is like right now, because too many leaders in Washington, D.C. have remained silent.
Congresswoman, you begin the next round, and let's stick with this topic. Do you support or oppose the way President Trump and Attorney General William Barr have handled the protests in this country?
Well, I'll begin by saying that record is far more important than rhetoric when it comes to supporting our nation's law enforcement officers. I'm a former federal law enforcement officer and the daughter of a career federal law enforcement officer, and I have voted to fund police departments across the country and specifically here in Virginia, notably just under $2 million coming home to Central Virginia's Chesterfield County. But my opponent in the House of Delegates has voted against funding the police, against bonus to law enforcement officers across the Commonwealth. And as it relates to how the Justice Department has handled protesters across the country, our First Amendment right says that we have the right to peaceably assemble, to advocate for what we believe in, to use our voices as Americans. And across this district, I participated in events where people were advocating for racial justice, for equity. And those were events, the one in Chesterfield County where the sheriff was there handing out bottles of water to participants. I have walked with protesters and those advocating for justice in Powhatan and in Louisa County, right alongside the police department. It's incredibly important that we all recognize the value of our voice and our constitutional right to use it. And I do not support the way that this administration has attempted to clamp down using gas on protesters in a public square who were peaceably assembled, which is their right.
Delegate Freitas.
If you look at all the areas where we've had violent protests, and I adamantly support people's First Amendment rights, I adamantly support their ability to go and protest any number of things, but when you start using violence in order to achieve a political objective, when you start hurting small business owners who did nothing wrong, that's a problem, and that's the part where you expect your local and state governments to be able to step in and provide protections for innocent people, and yet they continue to allow it to happen. The same governor that declared a state of emergency 2 days before a Second Amendment rally in Richmond during the legislative session waited for Richmond to burn for 2 days before he declared a state of emergency there. And there's one thing that all of these cities have in common, whether it's the incident with George Floyd or whether it's the violent protest that took place after that. Every single one of those cities have been almost under unilateral Democratic control for the last 50 years. They have promised people they would fix security. They have promised people they would fix education. They have promised people that they would fix infrastructure. And yet they allowed violent protesters to take over a peaceful protest, engage in destruction of property, engage in violence, which is going to lead to people actually leaving those areas where they need the tax base to improve schools and provide economic opportunities. So we've got a very clear picture with the way Democrat mayors and Democrat governors plan to handle violent riots, and that's to let them continue.
30-second rebuttal.
Violence is violence, destruction of property is destruction of property, but our First Amendment right is to peaceably assemble. And what we saw in Washington, D.C. when there was gas released on protesters is they were peaceably assembling. That is not right. It is against who we are as a people.
A state panel will hold a hearing next month about a replacement for Virginia's Robert E. Lee statue at the U.S. Capitol. Do you support or oppose the removal of the Lee statue, and generally, should Confederate monuments stay up or come down? Delegate Freitas.
I think one of the problems that I have with this entire approach is we had this debate in the General Assembly, and I voted against this idea of removing all of these monuments. The problem that I have is this. We need to have a robust and comprehensive discussion about our history. If that means including greater context, if it means putting up more monuments to civil rights leaders like Barbara Johns or Booker T. Washington, I think that is an excellent approach. But the problem that I'm seeing right now is that you have the D.C. mayor advocating removing all statues of all founding fathers, because ultimately I don't think this movement is about reconciliation. This movement is about Democrat politicians trying to distract from the fact that they have not been able to deliver on their promises in the cities that they have, the cities that they've controlled for decades. And now they're trying to point to an inanimate object as if that's going to make it better, when what we should be doing is focusing on the problems that really affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And this idea that we would rip down statues of Washington, of Jefferson, of Madison here in Virginia is just beyond the pale, and I do not support that.
Congresswoman Spanberger.
So to answer your question about the Lee statue and statues of the Confederacy, not of our founding fathers, I have voted in the House of Representatives with a bipartisan majority, Democrats and Republicans, who agreed that the statues of the Confederacy should come down from the U.S. Capitol and that we should rename military bases previously named for Confederate generals for heroes of our United States of America. And it's important to reference and note that these structures, while statues, represent so very much. And we, as a people, as Americans, should be focused on what structures could symbolize who we are and what we want to be into the future.
Let's turn to national security, an issue you both have backgrounds in. The FBI recently said Governor Northam was a possible target of militia groups. What should Congress do, if anything, to address the rise of these groups? We'll begin this round with Congresswoman Spanberger.
My background is in national security. I'm a former CIA officer, and I worked radicalism and anti-radicalism efforts as it related to counterterrorism. The growth of radical ideologies and extreme ideologies that would lead U.S. citizens to believe and create a plot whereby they would seek to abduct, create a sham trial, and then murder a sitting U.S. governor is indicative of a major issue, and it falls on all of us, any person in any level of elected office, to denounce these sorts of extreme or conspiratorial views that make us weaker as a country. And within Congress, it's important that we focus on and define what is domestic terrorism, because any group that would choose to abduct and murder a sitting governor in the United States of America is doing so for political reasons, and that is the sheer definition of terrorism. It's important that the FBI have the full ability to investigate cases of domestic terrorism, to root it out, and every single person on Capitol Hill or across the country should stand unified against that threat.
Delegate Freitas.
Any organization that decides to use violence against innocent people in order to achieve a political objective fits the definition of a terrorist organization and absolutely cannot be tolerated for the security of this country, for the security of our communities. And yes, the federal government has a role working in conjunction with state and local law enforcement in order to investigate, try, and prosecute to the full extent of the law any organization that advocates violence against the innocent in order to achieve their outcomes. I think it's also interesting, though, that for months now, I've been condemning violence since it started, because I've always held this position, and because doing 2 combat tours in Iraq, I have seen what terrorism does to communities and how it rips it apart, and the uncertainty and the violence that it leads to. What I don't understand is why so many Democrats remained absolutely silent as groups like Antifa were threatening violence, were engaging in violence, were hurting innocent people. There didn't seem to be any concern for it then. I've been concerned from it then, I'm concerned for it now, because it is always wrong and completely unacceptable in a free society.
You have both served this nation. So what is this nation's biggest national security challenge? We'll begin with Delegate Freitas.
There's a couple of things. One of the things that we have to look at is the threat that is obviously coming and being presented from China. That's both from a conventional weapons threat as well as asymmetric threats. The different technologies that they're developing, the cyber capabilities that they're developing, that's not just targeting our military infrastructure, but our economic infrastructure, has to be taken very seriously. Iran is a huge threat to the Middle East. It is a threat with respect to gaining nuclear weapons. North Korea is in the same boat. Russia also presents threats to regional stability within its area. We need to also get our debt under control, because if we're not able to actually finance our military and ensure that it's the best equipped and best trained in the world, that is going to pose significant security threats to our country. But I think that we need to prioritize, one, bringing our troops home from Afghanistan. They do not need to be there anymore. And then reprioritizing our defense spending so that we're actually addressing the coherent threats that we see coming out of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Congresswoman Spanberger.
There are many threats that present themselves to the United States. My background in national security, focused on understanding those threats, ensures that I know that part of the challenge here is the threat of China, is the threat of a country that would hurt American business through theft of intellectual property, but also through the use of information and technology that would leave U.S. companies and people vulnerable to hacking. And the strength that the United States has is our coalition with partners and friends in the face of a strong China. As it relates to Iran, a country that has long been a threat to the United States, a country where we work to ensure that we were thwarting the possibility of a nuclear Iran through our engagement with the JCPOA, an agreement that this president and this White House walked away from to the detriment of international relations and certainly to the detriment of a common goal of stopping Iranian nuclearization. And when we look at the threat to our democracy, that threat comes from Russia, from a country where we have not, as a country, seen a president stand up to the threat of an adversary nation that seeks to undermine our elections, that seeks to divide the American people. And what we must do as an American people is join together in the face of these threats. Join together recognizing that our position of global leadership is the one that makes us stronger. Our partnerships with friends and allies throughout the world is what brings us together in broad coalitions against the threats from Russia, China, Iran, and other authoritarians.
30-second rebuttal.
Congresswoman Spanberger, I have to say that deal with Iran did not ensure that they went to get a nuclear weapon. It probably put them on the fast track for it. And I want you to understand how frustrating it is for an Iraq combat veteran like myself who lost friends to Quds Force from Iran coming in and assisting violent militias within Iraq to see piles of cash of U.S. tax dollars showing up to the Iranian regime at the same time that we had no assurances that they were not going to actually develop nuclear weapons. If you really want to achieve peace and regional stability, you do that through strength, not dropping off taxpayer dollars to a terrorist regime in Iran.
We only have a few minutes left. I'm going to begin a lightning round. You've both agreed to keep your answers relatively brief, a sentence or two, if possible, in this lightning round. We'll begin the lightning round with Congresswoman Spanberger. If the Senate moves in the coming year to expand the Supreme Court, would you support or oppose that effort?
Well, in the House of Representatives, I think it's important to note that I oppose all politicization of the Supreme Court. I oppose ideas being floated by Democrats to pack a court, just as I oppose Republican efforts to cram through a nominee in record time.
Delegate Freitas.
Court packing is an assault on the institution of the court, and our American people need to understand that our political differences are supposed to be solved in Congress. We're not supposed to weaponize institutions which all Americans are supposed to be able to rely on for objectivity.
Delegate Freitas, if you have to give President Trump a grade for his response to the pandemic, what grade would you give him?
I think the overall grade with respect to the federal response is pretty good when you look at what the objective was of the federal government and the responsibility of the federal government. Restricting travel early on was very essential, and then getting medical resources to the places that needed it so that we could flatten the curve and make sure that we didn't overwhelm our medical system was accomplished. We do need to do more work with respect to the allocation of resources, and also to make sure the governors are doing a better job of, once they have those resources, getting them to the people that need them.
Congresswoman?
I would defer to the families of 220,000 Americans who have died of this virus, who died of this virus because it was able to plague our community in a way where other peer nations haven't experienced the scope and breadth and proportionate death. So I would defer to them to rank this. But moving forward, what we need to do as an American people is focus on a unified response, testing nationwide, access to PPE, and testing so that we can get this virus under control.
Congresswoman Spanberger, on climate change, should the United States rejoin the Paris Agreement?
Yes. The United States should continue to demonstrate its leadership when it comes to addressing issues of climate change, and we were doing that as part of the Paris Agreement, and we should return to it.
Delegate Freitas?
We left the Paris Accords and we reduced our carbon emissions by 140 million metric tons. China and the EU stayed within the Paris Accord and they increased theirs by 140 million metric tons. Not to mention the fact that there was a Republican bill that said that we could rejoin the Accord if it didn't cause a net loss of jobs to China, and Congresswoman Spanberger voted against that.
Delegate Freitas, should gun control and restricting the use of guns be a priority for Congress?
I think now more than ever we need to understand that people have an inherent right to be able to defend themselves, and the sort of gun confiscation bills that we saw within the Virginia General Assembly right now should be of huge concern for everybody that values your inherent right to be able to defend yourself.
Congresswoman?
I support the Second Amendment. I used to carry a firearm every day. I grew up in a household with firearms. The important thing here is that we be able to apply the same standard of the law when it comes to the background check that one undergoes when they buy a firearm in a place like Cabela's. That same standard should be applied across the board. It's common sense, and it's what the majority of Americans want.
Congresswoman, if the Food and Drug Administration approves a vaccine for the coronavirus, would you be willing to take it?
Yes, absolutely. And I just led a piece of legislation ensuring that seniors across the United States would be able to receive such a vaccine free of cost.
Delegate Freitas?
Yes, I would, and I think the administration deserves some credit for removing a lot of the regulations that have stood in the way not only of this vaccine being created in a timely manner, but several other types of life-saving drugs that if we could just reduce those regulations could get into the hands of people that needed them at prices they could afford.
Delegate Freitas, what's one issue if the president next year is a Democrat that you could work with them on?
When it comes to things like civil asset forfeiture reform within the umbrella of criminal justice reform, I think that's something that I've worked on with Democrats in the House of Delegates. We managed to achieve that this year, and I think that's something that I could work on with anybody. I believe in the Frederick Douglass quote, I will work with anybody to do good and nobody to do evil.
If it's President Trump next year still in the White House, what's one issue you could work with him on, Congresswoman?
I have a demonstrated track record of working with President Trump. I went to the White House, met with President Trump to focus on border security and get our government back open. I went to the White House and met with Vice President Pence to work to get USMCA over the line. If there is a continuation of the Trump administration, I will continue to work with the president on issues that matter to Central Virginians.
We have 1 minute left. Congresswoman, FBI Director Chris Wray has testified that there is not widespread voter fraud. Do you accept his conclusion?
I believe and trust the FBI and the hard work of the men and women of the federal law enforcement agency, yes.
Delegate Freitas?
There are so many numbers of state legislative bills that have passed that have reduced the integrity of our overall elections that it is of concern, but I still have faith in the integrity of our elections and I believe in the peaceful transition of power.
And final question. When you think ahead to infrastructure in 2021, we'll go with Delegate Freitas. What should be the priority on infrastructure?
Rural broadband. When we look at our overall infrastructure package, we need to understand that as we're improving roads, as we're improving electrical lines, that presents an excellent opportunity to use existing easements and resources. One of the biggest problems is having to go back and actually dig everything up once you've already put the road in place, the power lines in place. If we can actually do that as we're improving this infrastructure, it is going to go a long way in order to get people the internet they need without putting the government in control of it.
Quickly.
Rural broadband, it's a need of Central Virginia. I've been fighting for it since I arrived in Congress. I work to protect valuable investments in the Reconnect program that's already delivered $28 million in grants to Central Virginia. Unfortunately, my opponent voted against a bill that would make it easier to use easements throughout Central Virginia to bring rural broadband to the communities that need it so much.
It's now time to begin our closing statements. Per the rules, Delegate Freitas, you will go first.
Well, once again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and seeing this debate. I really wish we could have had one before early voting started, but my opponent didn't want to. I think the other thing that is not going to show up in any of the ads that you've seen is the fact that my opponent votes with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez almost 90% of the time and then comes back to the district and claims to be a moderate. She has voted for legislation which will eventually lead to gun confiscation. She has voted for legislation that will make it significantly more difficult for small businesses to be able to hire people that desperately need a job. She has voted for a federal takeover of election law. She's voted for a bill called H.R. 1 that would actually give government funds to political campaigns. So now you are forced to subsidize the political ads I'm sure you're already sick of seeing. I don't think this is a record of moderation. And I think going forward, what we need in the 7th District is not necessarily left or right, but reasonable versus unreasonable. And as we look forward to the challenges that we all face, we know we need to lower taxes in order to help individuals and businesses. We know we need to get our regulatory environment under control so that business owners aren't spending over $1 trillion a year in regulatory compliance when they should be providing the products and services that we all need. We know we need a strong national defense, and we need to equip our military and bring our troops home from Afghanistan. And we know we need to be able to support our law enforcement while at the same time providing the sort of law enforcement reform that will put communities back in control with respect to the sort of policing that we get. These are all issues that I have worked on in the General Assembly for the last 5 years. I have over 20 bills signed into law, all of them with bipartisan support, working on things like career technical education, apprenticeship programs, government transparency, property rights, and we can do the same thing in Washington, D.C. So I thank you very much for giving us this hearing, and I'm asking for your vote on November 3rd. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Freitas. Congresswoman Spanberger, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much for being here this evening. Thank you so much to everyone who's watching at home. I hope you're staying safe. During my time in Congress, I have focused on serving the people of this district. It's how I have sponsored and passed legislation focused on border security, keeping children safe from online predators, and ensuring that we have a national plan to fight to protect 5G technologies and develop our own strategy. Legislation I have passed with bipartisan support, signed into law by this president. I have a strong record of working in a bipartisan manner. I am rated as the most bipartisan member of the Virginia delegation because that is how we get things done. I have been intentional with my focus of working across the aisle and with everyone to try and deliver for this district. It's why I passed a bill focused on lowering the cost of prescription drugs with a vote of 403-0, because I built a coalition of Democrats and Republicans who believed in the principle of transparency. And as I listen to voters across this district, I hear that the need for relief is there. And that's why I have been working aggressively to ensure that we can deliver that relief, fighting for another COVID relief package, and standing up to my party when partisan politics was delaying those negotiations that would bring it home. That's why I've been working to pass legislation that would allow Medicare to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs, because it's vitally, vitally important that people across our community be able to afford the life-saving drugs that they rely on and not have to make decisions between putting food on the table and whether or not to pay their rent or buy their prescriptions. I've been endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce because of my work on behalf of small businesses. I've been named a friend of the Farm Bureau because my focus has been on the people, the businesses, and the enterprises of this district. I want to continue serving this district. It's the district where I grew up, the district where I am raising my 3 children, and I thank you very much for your attention this evening, and I ask for your vote between now and November 3rd. Thank you so much, and stay safe.
This has been an interesting and civil evening. Really appreciate it. Congresswoman Spanberger, Delegate Freitas, wish you the best of luck. I was born in Richmond, Virginia, so it's great to be back in this district, and I really wish you the best and the voters all the best. But it's wonderful to see democracy in action and no fights, just good conversation, good discussion. We're going to have to leave it there for this evening. Again, many thanks to the nominees in both parties, and thank you all for joining us. This has been Virginia Decides, a 7th Congressional District Forum brought to you by VPM News and ChamberRVA. I'm Robert Costa. Good night.
I'm Irish?
On finding your